Thanks, Paul. So as Paul said, I'm going to talk through the changes in the fiscal forecast yesterday, and specifically the new path of borrowing. And that's going to have two components. Firstly, the underlying change in the economy that's led to a downgrade and an increase in borrowing. And then also further measures that Mr. Hammond has chosen to announce. And that actually amounts to a fiscal loosening, mostly due to higher investment spending. I'll try to put that investment spending in a bit of context in terms of how much we've tended to spend on investment in the past. And then I'll compare our new path for borrowing with what the Conservative and Labour parties were planning as of the election in 2015. Okay, so first I'm going to run through the change in the underlying forecast. So this top line here is what we were planning to borrow in March 2016 in the budget. And as I'm sure you're all very aware, we were all going to reach a surplus of £10 billion in 2019-20. And what I'm going to run through in this table is how the underlying forecast, so before any of Mr. Hammond's measures, changed. Now, firstly, as Paul said, there are some classification changes that we won't bore you with, but broadly this affects the timing of corporation tax receipts, which was always a temporary measure and flattered the numbers somewhat in 2019-20. A new classification change means those numbers are no longer flattered. But how much worse have things got since March? Well, you may be interested into how much can we attribute to a Brexit effect. The OBR have an estimate of this. They think that borrowing will be £15.2 billion a year higher in 2020-21, or to put another way, £290 million a week. Okay, so where have the changes in the overall fiscal forecast come from? So firstly, inflation is now forecast to be higher. That affects the public finances in two ways. Firstly, spending on, for example, public service pensions is linked to inflation. Inflation goes up, you spend more on those. And also some thresholds in the tax system are also uprated with inflation, so we also raise less tax revenue. So how has the forecast for inflation changed? This is what the OBR was expecting in March, with a steady rise in inflation up to the Bank of England's 2% target. This is what they're now expecting. They're anticipating a really large rise over the next few quarters to around 2.5% before it returns to target in around 2%. Now it's interesting to compare the OBR forecast to the Bank of England, who also produced a forecast in early November. And actually they expect the inflation effect to be somewhat larger. They expect inflation to peak at a higher point and to remain higher for longer. So we have that effect of inflation on the public finances. If inflation turns out to be more like the Bank of England expect than the OBR, then that could be a somewhat larger effect. Now, the largest downgrade is due to a weaker economy. So this is weaker income growth, weaker consumption growth, weaker profits, and also a weaker property market. And this costs about £12 billion in 2019-20. So again, we can do the same thing for the growth forecasts. So as Paul said, both the Bank of England and the OBR broadly agreed before the referendum as to how much the economy was likely to grow, and this was steady, if unspectacular, growth. Now the OBR today have this new forecast, and you can see that growth is now forecast to be, or GDP is now forecast to be lower for the entire period. And overall growth is forecast to grow by, the economy is forecast to grow by 1.4% less than the OBR expected in March. But again, it's useful to compare this to the Bank of England, who broadly agree with the OBR for the first couple of years of the forecast, but then have a somewhat more gloomy outlook. And indeed, the cumulative effect here is that the OBR expects growth to be 0.8% higher than the Bank of England expects. So again, we have that 12 billion hit from GDP, or from economic weakness. If the economy were to turn out more like the Bank of England expects than the OBR expects, again, the public finances could take a further hit. Now, the vote to leave the European Union also benefited the public finances in certain ways. In particular, equity prices and oil prices in pounds terms have increased, and that's largely due to a depreciation in sterling, and interest rates have also decreased, which reduces the amount that the government has to spend on debt interest spending. And each of those saves takes about £3 billion off borrowing. Now, as Paul mentioned, there have actually been quite large revisions to the forecast for this year, with £8 billion higher borrowing this year due to a weakness in receipts. This is particularly due to a weakness in receipts from taxes on income, so pay-as-you-earn income tax, and national insurance contributions, the OBR has decided that its forecast was somewhat optimistic for this year and thinks that much of that weakness will actually persist across the whole forecast period. So this quite substantial downgrade further weakens the fiscal position. So overall, we have these changes just to the underlying forecast before Mr. Hammond did any measures of about £18 billion. Now that is, of course, a substantial downgrade, but as Paul mentioned, it's by no means the largest downgrade we've seen. In the autumn statements of 2011 and 2012, the equivalent downgrade was £30 billion or more. So this is not the biggest downgrade that we've seen, although it is, of course, larger than average. Okay, so that was the forecast that Mr. Hammond faced. So 2 weeks ago, Mr. Hammond would have been given that forecast, and then he had to decide how to respond to that. So what this table is going to do is go through what measures Mr. Hammond took. So as Paul mentioned, on the whole, it was quite a quiet autumn statement. There weren't too many measures, and on tax, there was really very little, a small net takeaway, but really not much in the aggregate. Spending changes were rather more substantial. We had the U-turn already announced on some welfare policies, and in particular on disability benefits, and that slightly increases planned spending in 2020-21, but much more substantially is other spending. And I'm now going to spend a little bit of time talking through that. So spending by departments has been revised from March to November. So this chart shows the profile planned in March and the new one planned in November, and you can see that the cut now is smaller than was initially planned. The real cut now is about £14.5 billion between 2016 and 2019, which is kind of from this year to that trough. Now, where has this come from? So you see day-to-day departmental spending is broadly unchanged. There's still planned to be a real terms cut of about £19.3 billion between 2016 and 2019. So the day-to-day spending of departments is still being squeezed about as much as it was in March, which means, of course, that the big change has come in capital or investment departmental spending. What was initially going to be a small fall in investment spending is now a small real increase. Now, as Paul said, these are actually quite substantial increases in investment, and it's good to dwell a little bit on where he's actually spending that. So he's committed more money to housing, to roads, to telecoms and R&D, which I think we would generally consider to be good focuses of investment spending. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on one of those in particular, which is on R&D spending. Now this shows economy-wide R&D spending across a number of countries as a proportion of GDP. You'll see the UK over there on your right lags behind somewhat our main competitors. In particular, we lag far behind Germany, the USA and France. And you'll notice that we lag behind them partly because our businesses spend less in R&D, but also because our government spends less. Now, the government have committed to £2 billion extra a year, which compared to what they currently do is a genuinely substantial increase, and is a good move. But because government spending as a proportion of total R&D is pretty small, we're not suddenly going to be flying up that chart anytime soon. Okay, so I said that it was actually quite a substantial increase in investment spending. How does this compare to recent history? So this graph shows the profile of investment spending since the mid-1980s and what we were planning to do in March. So how does our new November plan change? So initially we were going to be spending less than 2% of GDP for the rest of this Parliament. We're now going to be spending more, between 2 and 2.5%. Now you see that this is quite a lot larger than we've achieved for most of the last 3 decades. And if you replace the kind of strange stuff going on around the financial crisis with what the Labour government were planning in March 2008, you'll see that Mr. Hammond is planning to spend roughly the same amount that Mr. Darling was planning to spend, and that if he could achieve this, this would be one of the largest. This would be a very large level of investment relative to what we've achieved over the last 3 decades. Okay, so back to the big picture. We've had a downgrade to the economic forecasts. We've had a slight net giveaway from the Chancellor. What does this do to borrowing overall? So this is the profile we were expecting in March, and we were hoping to reach a £10 billion surplus in 2019-20. This is what happens now. and that small surplus turns into a slightly larger deficit. Now, it's interesting to compare this profile of borrowing to what the parties were planning to do in the 2015 general election. So we calculated this at the time. So this is the forecast that we have from our most recent statement. This is what Mr. Osborne was planning to do, which was to reach a total surplus by 2018-19. You can see that, and we now have a considerably weaker fiscal position than that. But if you compare this to Labour's plan, it's even weaker than what Labour were planning to implement, indeed by about £16 billion in 2018-19. So this really is a much weaker fiscal position than we were kind of anticipating at the 2015 general election. Okay, so let me just summarise what I've shown you there. So underlying economic changes led to about £18 billion more borrowing in 2020-21, which is a large downgrade, but by no means unprecedented, and actually smaller than we saw in 2011 or 2012. Additionally, Mr. Hammond chose to loosen fiscal policy, mostly through an increase in investment spending. And this means that public sector net investment will rise above 2% of national income, which will be higher than we've achieved for most of the last 3 decades. And the investment spending is really focused in housing, telecoms, roads and R&D, which, as I said, are sensible places to focus your investment. And finally, this worse forecast combined with a net giveaway means that the path of borrowing is now actually above the path that was implied by Mr. Bull's 2015 election plan. So I'm now going to pass over to Carl, who's going to talk about Mr. Hammond's new fiscal rules.